young adult novels, and books for middle grade readers. I had a picture book out last year. I write nonfiction about tech policy and about other issues as well. For nearly 20 years now, 19 years, I've worked with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a digital human rights group based in San Francisco. I was their European director for many years, stationed in London. I'm a Canadian, though I was naturalized British while I was there, and now I live in Burbank, just outside of Los Angeles. And I'm about to be naturalized as an American as well. So I'm three kinds of person, I suppose. I was asked to come and speak to you about copyright and its kind of wider dimensions. My plan is to talk for about 30 or 35 minutes. I'm going to read a paper I wrote on the subject with some dramatic interpretation, and then take your questions. And thank you in advance for being here and asking me to come by and chat with you. It's a pleasure. So the piece I'm going to read, it ran in Locus magazine under the title IP, and you'll find out more about that as I read it. You've probably heard of open source software, and if you pay attention to the politics of this stuff, you may have even heard of free software. You might know a little about the ethical debate underpinning the war of words between those two labels. I've been involved in this since the last century, but I never really understood what was going on in the background until recently. It came when I was looking up the history of the free software license and had a revolution that transformed the way I think about it, which is significant since to a first approximation, this is the only thing I think about. Some background. Free software has its origins with the AI researcher turned activist Richard Stallman, who started his GNU project in 1983, leading to the creation of the first GNU General Public License, or GPL. It's a copyright license for computer programmers who want to share their work. If you release a program's underlying source code under the GPL, that means that anyone is free to run your program and study your code and improve your code and to share that improved code with others, but they have to apply the same license to it. The GPL is a copyright license for software, and it arrived at the same moment as copyright for software arrived. Prior to 1983, software was generally viewed as a, quote, functional work, and functional works aren't eligible for copyright. But in 1983, Apple brought its Apple v. Franklin lawsuit, and that, combined with some 1980 amendments to the Copyright Act, established that software could be copyrighted. So by choosing to apply the GPL to this newly copyrightable code, programmers could kind of undo this decision. They could lock their code open and ensure not only that others could build on it, but that no one could take that work and then close it again. Now, that's not what free software and open source mean today. Today, the act of licensing your code as free software, it's a kind of mark of forbearance. It's your promise as a software author not to seek a legal sanction against anyone who creates new programs that read and write your program's data, or against those who fork off their own competing versions of that program. So today, to make your software free is to promise that users will have freedom. As the saying goes, free as in speech, even if it's not free as in beer. But in 1998, free software underwent a reinvention. There was a more business oriented group of technical people and entrepreneurs, and they were worried that the term free software was alienating to the commercial sector, both because it stressed freedom and because it implied that the code would be free of charge, and that would mean that they couldn't commercialize it. So those people coined the term open source, a rival term that stressed the instrumental benefits of allowing people to scrutinize your code. If you open up your code to scrutineers, they would root out the defects in it. They would prevent the nefarious subversion of that code to spy on or steal data from its users. As the open source movement said, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. But let's go back to 1983, to the birth of free software, and recall what it meant when free software was born. When free software was born, software copyright was brand new. It wasn't widespread, and it wasn't clear which activities copyright on software prohibited. Software patents, they were basically unheard of and essentially impossible to secure. And then terms of service, the shrink wrap licenses and other contracts of adhesion that you agree to simply by running code or opening a box or taking some other mundane and unsuspecting step, they weren't considered enforceable. There were no laws against bypassing so-called digital rights management. Those are the copy controls that you sometimes get on games and other kinds of software, as well as music and movies, that's supposed to limit how you use the software. That's illegal to break today, but it wasn't back then. And these new exotic para copyrights, like the one that the Supreme Court is currently deliberating over in the Oracle v. Google case, where Oracle has said that APIs, which are the programmatic interfaces, the ways that two programs talk to each other, that they should be eligible for copyright. They not only didn't exist, no one even thought that they could exist back then. So, in other words, when free software was born, if you wanted to clone or interoperate with or improve or modify any existing software, whether or not it was free software, all you needed to do was reverse engineer that software and you could go to town. So, the GPL wasn't a promise of forbearance, right? It wasn't a promise not to prosecute. There was no right to prosecute people who reverse engineered your code and when free software was born. The GPL, people who knew how to make software already behaved as though forking code, interoperating with code, reverse engineering code, that was something they were permitted to do, irrespective of the feelings of the company or the individual whose code they were dealing with. So the GPL wasn't a promise to forbear. The GPL was a request for companies and software authors to make it easier to interoperate with them, to skip the tedious business of reverse engineering by handing out source code. And of course, at that time, there was a massive shortage of computer programmers. There was a lot more need for people to write code than there were people who could write code. And so it was a kind of normative story too. You know, here we are, we few, we proud, we brave, who know how to make software. Do we really want to absorb the precious moments that we have to write all the code that the world needs? That is a task that hopelessly overmatches us. Do we want to waste our time reverse engineering each other's code? Just make the code available. The GPL, in other words, was icing on the cake. If you applied the GPL to your code, you weren't forswearing legal vengeance against those who wanted to make compatible things that worked with your thing. You had no right to that vengeance. Applying the GPL to the code was a way of signaling that you wanted to collaborate with those interoperators rather than, impotently shaking your fist at them from the sidelines, as they went right ahead and interoperated with your code against your wishes, an act against which you had no recourse. Now, 40 years later, the world is a very different place. Between software copyrights, anti circumvention rules, software patents, enforceable terms of service, trade secrecy, non compete agreements, and the pending Oracle Google dispute over API copyrights, any attempt to interoperate with an existing product or service without permission from its corporate master is a legal suicide mission. It's an invitation for almost unlimited civil and criminal litigation. That is to say, if you were to dare to improve, modify, or replace an existing dominant software based product or service, you would be risking bankruptcy and even a long prison sentence. 40 years ago, we had cake and we demanded icing to go on top of it. Today, all that's left is the icing, and we've forgotten that the cake was ever free. If your code isn't licensed as free, you'd best leave it alone. So in that history, I use the term interoperability a lot. What is interoperability anyway? The term is a technical, nerdy, obscure one. It's closely related to the maybe more familiar term compatibility, but they're not quite equivalent. In a technical sense, interoperability describes two products or services that somehow work together with one another. From opening a Word document in Google Docs, or using a third party ink cartridge in your printer, or just putting a new band on your watch, or changing the stereo that came with your car, interoperability is a broad, universal, and essential characteristic of all of our technology. Interoperability is the default state of the world. If you've got a barbecue, you can burn anyone's charcoal in it. Anyone's gas will make your car go. Any manufacturer can make a light bulb that'll fit in your light socket. And if you buy some shoes, you can buy any socks you want and use them with them. And to a certain extent, this interoperability is deliberate. It's part of something called standardization, which is when manufacturers, academics, regulators, and interested parties gather in these standards development organizations, or SDOs, to make the process simpler. So they might describe the canonical direction and spacing of the thread on a light bulb, or the syntax of an HTTP request, or the fittings on the underside of a toilet. And this does make interoperability a lot smoother. Think of the standards for paper. We have weight, grams per square meter or GSM, and we have size, legal and letter or tabloid, or in the rest of the world, we have A1, A2, A3, and A4. And this makes it possible for you to reliably buy paper that will work with your printer without requiring any modifications like trimming it so that it'll fit inside the printer. And a failure to standardize can make life hard for everyone. In early Australian history, early settler colonial Australian history, the rail barons laid their tracks in different gauges, leading to what the Australians today call the multi gauge muddle of a rail system, where some cars and some engines can't run on some of the tracks. Now, these barriers to interoperability aren't insurmountable. If your paper doesn't fit in your envelope, you can fold it. If it doesn't fit in your printer, you can trim it. If the rail gauge doesn't match the rolling stock, you can try modifying the undercarriages so that the cars can drop one set of wheels and retract another. They've tried that for 150 years. After 300 designs, they've rejected that and they've got a new plan. They're just tearing up the rails and putting in thousands of kilometers of new track. Interoperability is a way to lower switching costs. The cost of leaving behind whatever you're using now in favor of something you think will suit you better. My grandparents emigrated to Canada from the Soviet Union on a displaced persons trip after the war. They were refugees, and they incurred a very high switching costs. For more than a decade, my grandmother had no contact with her family in Leningrad, except through this very unreliable, slow word of mouth with the rare person who got a visa to visit the Soviet Union. Now, by contrast, I used to live in the United Kingdom and I moved to Los Angeles in 2015. I'm in routine contact with my in laws in London and Wales and my family in Toronto. My laptop, all my books, they came with me, and so did some other personal effects. We did leave behind most of our appliances because they ran on different voltage, but there are a few things we loved that we brought with and either changed the plugs on or connected to our house's electrical outlets via transformer adapters. You can see maybe in that corner, there's a, let me see if I can get that in there, my theremin, which my wife gave me for Christmas one year, came with me, and I can use my British theremin here on my American voltage. Now, companies don't like this. They like high switching costs. For a would-be monopolist, the best product is one that's very easy to start using and very hard to stop using. Think of Purdue Pharma's gleeful internal memos revealed in leaks and court cases about the ease with which their so-called customers were getting started on their opioids, OxyContin, and how hard it was for those same customers to stop using their products. Addiction is not the only way to raise switching costs. Facebook makes it very easy to get started. Historically, they even went so far as to tricking you into giving them access to your electronic contacts lists so that as soon as you arrived, they could enmesh you in a network of others who'd already signed up for the service. Once you're on Facebook, it's really easy to use Facebook as a portal to read the whole public web. You can link to your friends' updates on services that aren't Facebook, on services that publish those updates to the world. You can start by using Facebook just to follow the friends you have there, but over time, the system is designed to nudge you towards using your Facebook as your primary means of reading the news and even following what your friends are saying, not just on Facebook, but off of it. But when you want to leave Facebook, there's no easy way to do so. You can't go to a Facebook rival and follow your friends from there. You certainly can't reply to what your Facebook friends are posting from another service. Interoperability, the thing that Facebook uses to slurp in data from the open web, it's the key to self determination. Leaving Facebook in the 21st century is like my grandmother leaving the USSR in the 40s. You can go, but your friends and your loved ones are all held hostage behind Zuck's Iron Curtain. And leaving Facebook means leaving behind your communities and your relationships. It's not as hard as kicking opioids, but it's not easy. And your presence on Facebook is the reason that somebody else is locked in there. You have mutually taken one another hostage. Now, here's the thing. Everybody wants to minimize their risk, from employers to workers, from tech companies to tech users. You want to use Google in ways that make your life better, and you don't want Google to be able to arbitrarily change or remove the services it provides. Ask me how bitter I am about Google nuking Reader, its RSS product that I utterly relied on, and which they removed with very little ceremony. Google wants to ensure that you won't leave the company or its products and services. Now, it could improve the retention by making you so delighted with its offerings that you would never even consider leaving. But a surer and cheaper way to interweave its products and services is to interweave its products and services with your life. To make sure that your kid can't go to a public school without creating a Google account, embedding Google search in your mobile operating system, releasing web and app development frameworks for third parties that quietly harvest the data of their users and send all that data to Google. The more freedom you have to leave Google, the bigger a risk you present to Google. The more Google can lock you in, the lower the risk of your departure from the service, and the higher the risk that Google will cease to keep your business by making good products and instead rely on retaining you because you can't leave. Interoperability improves your self determination by safeguarding your ability to change your current situation in incremental steps. If you like your phone and the apps that you have, but you want an app that's banned in your phone's app store, interoperability comes to the rescue. You can just add another app store and your software and use that software on your phone. You get to keep your phone, you get to keep your apps, you get to keep the data on your phone, and you get to install an unauthorized app. But without interoperability, it doesn't work like that. Without interoperability, your choice is take it or leave it. If the App Store blocks an app that you want, the price of getting that app is throwing away the phone, all of its apps, and some or all of the data you've painstakingly input into that phone. That unauthorized app, it better be pretty goddamn good before anyone's going to pay such a price for it. Writ large, interoperability encompasses things like democracy. When someone says they like a city but not its bylaws, we don't tell them the law is the law and the home comes with the bylaws as a package. Instead, we set out a process for amending or repealing laws that chafe the people that they govern. And if you fail in your bid to reform your city's laws, you can move to another city and you don't have to surrender your possessions or your social relations with your old neighbors. Interoperability lets you replace the laws and keep the house, or replace the house and find new laws. Now, this whole line of thought started with a reflection on the history of the free software movement, that largely forgotten time in which the default condition of software was freedom. In the absence of copyright, patent, anti circumvention, terms of service, non competes, confidentiality, and all the other commonplaces of today's software marketplace, anyone who could figure out how to reverse engineer a program could improve it, replace some or all of it, read and write its files, compete with it, or sideline it. Today, this is no longer the case. In fact, today's software marketplace is so unlike this previous cake and icing world, where the default was software freedom, cake, and the free software movement made its audacious demand for freely reusable source code as a way of making software freedom as frictionless as possible, icing. Today, it's virtually impossible to imagine that time. The thicket of anti interoperability rules that has sprung up around interoperability has a catch name. We call it intellectual property. Now, free software advocates and free culture advocates hate the term intellectual property. Their argument against the term rails against its imprecision and its rhetorical dishonesty. Prior to the rise of intellectual property as an umbrella term, the different legal regimes it refers to were referred to by their individual names. If you were talking about patents, you said patents. And you were talking about copyrights, you said copyrights. When you're talking about trademarks, you said trademarks. Bunching together copyrights and trademarks and patents and other rules wasn't particularly useful because these are all really different legal regimes. If there was a rare instance where all of these laws had to be grouped together, the usual term we used for them was an author's monopoly. Now, the anti IP argument leans into the differences between the underlying rationale for each of these rules. For example, in the US, copyright exists to promote the useful arts and sciences. It's there in the Constitution. There's only two clauses in the Constitution that explain why the framers thought they should put them there. One is the copyright clause to promote the useful arts and sciences. The other one's the Second Amendment. Yeah, you can have guns, but it has to be part of an orderly militia. It's not just like have guns. They really wanted to make it clear that these authors' monopolies had a reason, and if you couldn't serve the reason, you shouldn't have them. Copyright, therefore, only extends to expressions of ideas and doesn't cover ideas to minimize the risk that someone can actually own a concept. Now, patents exist as an incentive to get inventors to reveal the workings of their inventions. If you want a patent, you have to send the patent office a detailed drawing and an account. And it used to be even a model of how your patented invention worked. Now, other people aren't allowed to copy your patent during the duration of the patent, but they do get to study the model. They do get to read your documentation. They get to figure out how to do what you've done in a different way. They get to figure out how to make something that plugs into your invention. And when your patent expires, they get to make copies of your invention without you stopping them. Trademarks, completely different yet again. They're consumer protection. Trademark is a way for manufacturers to punish rivals, not for undermining their profits, but for deceiving their customers, for using words and graphics and logos in ways that might deceive a consumer into thinking that they're buying a product from one company when really they're buying it from another. Coke's trademark rights don't deputize it, don't cover non-deceptive, non-confusing uses of its marks, even if those uses harm Coca-Cola, because they don't harm Coke drinkers. Seen in this light, intellectual property is incoherent. When you assert that your work has intellectual property, do you mean that you can sue rivals to protect your customers from deception, or that the government will block rivals if you only disclose the inner workings of a machine, or that you've been given just enough but no more incentive to publish the expressions of your ideas with the understanding that the ideas are fair game? But here's the thing. When you look at how IP is used by firms, a very precise, if colloquial, meaning emerges to explain what intellectual property is. Intellectual property is any law that I can invoke that allows me to control the conduct of my customers, my critics, and my competitors. Say that again. Intellectual property is any law that I can invoke to control the conduct of my customers, my critics, and my competitors. That is, in a world of uncertainty, where other people's unpredictable actions erode your profits, mire you in scandal, or even tank your business, IP is a means of forcing other people to arrange their affairs to suit your needs, even if that's to their needs. Now, there's some ways in which this is obvious and undeniable. Take DRM, or digital rights management. These are the digital locks in our devices that prevent us from using them in ways that the manufacturer dislikes. Your printer uses DRM to force you to buy ink that the manufacturer has approved. Your phone uses DRM to force you to buy apps from the manufacturer's app store. Ventilators from Medtronic and tractors from John Deere use DRM to force you to get them repaired by the manufacturer, and also to scrap them once the manufacturer decides that it's time for you to buy a new one. Copyright laws, that is, IP laws, ban tampering with DRM, making it a serious jailable felony to provide others with tools to bypass DRM. And this is a global regime. Section 1201 of the US Digital Millennium Copyright Act and Canada's Bill C-32 and Article 6 of the European Copyright Directive. All around the world, there are countries that have felonized breaking DRM. Now, these are all copyright laws, but importantly, the ban on breaking DRM does not limit itself to copyright infringement. If you bypass DRM to get your printer to accept third-party ink, you're not violating copyright. You're not reproducing that printer's code. You're not duplicating the traces on its chips. But even though you're not breaking copyright when you jailbreak your phone, you are still breaking copyright law. The law, in other words, is a prohibition on legal conduct if you have to break DRM in order to engage in that conduct. So this isn't copyright protection, it's business model protection. It's a form of felony contempt of business model. And it's not just DRM. Take Goldman Sans. Now that's a free font that was released by the finance giant and global supervillain Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sans, it's a copyrighted work, and it comes with a copyright license that you agree to when you download the font. Among the license terms for Goldman Sachs is a non-disparagement clause, a clause that prohibits you from criticizing Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs doesn't need copyright law to prevent you from copying its font. It gives the font away for free. It wants you to copy it. Goldman Sachs needs copyright law so it can boss you around, so it can tell you what you may and may not say. The risks to free expression and self-determination, they've always been latent in copyright, patent, and trademark, and these laws have historically been designed to mitigate these risks. Each one of these laws has its own escape valve, theoretically, that stops IP owners from using their rights to take away your rights. So in copyright, there's fair use, and other countries have things like fair dealing or limitations and exceptions. And fair use allows for many kinds of copying, adapting, displaying, and even selling other people's copyrighted expressions, provided that these activities promote a free and robust discourse by transforming, commenting on, or analyzing the copyrighted work. Fair use doesn't depend on a copyright holder's permission. You can make fair use not only if the rights holder doesn't want you to, but especially if the rights holder doesn't want you to. For example, if you're criticizing them in ways that they'd like you to stop. Patent has its own escape valve, publication. Remember, to get a patent, you have to disclose how the invention works, and the disclosures are on display from the minute your patent is granted, and anyone can study them and use them as inspiration for their own inventions. Patents allow you to punish people who duplicate your invention, but they also require you to tell other people to exactly what steps they need to make to make a machine that does exactly what your machine does, but without violating your patent. Trademark has its own escape valves. First, it's limited to being used against rivals who use marks in deceptive ways that cause public confusion. And secondly, it's subjected to what's called the nominative defense. It's not a violation of trademark to use a trademark to describe the good or service that the trademark is associated with. You can put a sign in your shop window that says, "We fix iPhones," or "Cheap ink for HP printers," or "Our cola tastes better than Coke." And there's nothing that trademark holders can do about it. Now, these trademarks turn out to have been a lot less durable than we might have hoped. It turns out that much of their efficacy depends on there being robust competition in the marketplace. So when one company tries to narrow fair use in court, other companies that rely on fair use will spring up to defend it. Through the past 4 decades of massive consolidation in every industry, a consensus has emerged among the shareholder and managerial classes that these escape valves aren't essential. Indeed, they're defects in these otherwise excellent laws. And these managers and investors have set to work creating legal precedents, new laws, and new legal tactics that jam these escape valves shut. That's how we went from having software freedom cake to just the icing. New copyright laws, like the one that bans breaking DRM, new copyright precedents, like the one Oracle is seeking in its Supreme Court case against Google, and new tactics for combining copyrights, patents, trademarks, DRM, trade secrets, and other IP, so that what permits, the copyright will prohibit, and what copyright permits, the patent will block, and so on, until all certainty has been moved onto the manufacturer's side of the deal, and all the risk has been moved onto yours. Recall that the term of art that preceded IP was the author's monopoly. The tale of how the latter was replaced by the former has many variations, but there's one thing that everyone agrees on, no matter which version of the story they tell, and that's that it's no fun to be called a monopolist. If you think you don't have enough copyright, it's really hard to go to Congress or Parliament and demand an expansion of your regulatory monopoly. It's far more pleasant to show up and say that you need help defending your property. There is a strict sense in which copyrights, and especially patents, are monopolies. When you write down a collection of words, like this book that I wrote, um, that act causes a new copyright to be born. I have the exclusive right to reproduce, adapt, display, and sell that book. Now, my rivals can hope to compete with me by writing different books that they hope to sell to the same publishers to tempt the same readers with. But I and I alone can sell this book that I wrote. In that sense, I obviously have a monopoly on that book. Market for a product with only one seller is the purest form of monopoly that there is. But as is often the case with law, a commonly used word has a different specialized meaning and when it's applied to legal contexts. And in competition law, a monopoly is not someone who controls 100% of the supply of a good or service. In competition law, we say you have a monopoly if you have market power. If you have the power to set prices without regard to competition, without regard to what people are willing to pay. After HP sells you a printer, it can charge whatever it wants for the ink. Now, you could junk your printer and buy another one, but HP's rivals also charge absurd markups on ink, and they also use DRM and IP to punish competitors who introduce cheap ink into the market. The people who bristled at having copyrights called monopolies have a point. Authors don't really have market power. Authors, even bestsellers like me, we have limited power to convince our publishers to pay over the odds. There's a few superstar exceptions, Stephen King and J.K. Rowling, but they're as rare as meteor strikes. Overwhelmingly, having a copyright does not confer market power on an author. However, there are actual no fooling market power monopolies in the entertainment industry. There's one movie theater chain that controls the vast majority of cinema screens, AMC, which is likely to go bankrupt and end up a division of one of the three movie studios. There are three record labels, three movie studios, four publishers, a single brick and mortar bookstore chain, and one global online bookstore, which also effectively owns the audiobook market. How did those monopolies emerge? Well, in some ways, they came out of the same place that every other monopoly came from. In energy, eyewear, finance, automotive, aerospace, accounting, civil engineering, logistics, beer, athletic shoes, all of those monopolies came about as a result of lax antitrust enforcement. Up until 40 years ago, we prohibited companies from growing by buying or merging with their competitors or by creating vertical monopolies where they control different parts of the supply chain. For 40 years, we've let companies grow by buying small competitors before they could grow to become threats, by merging with major competitors and no longer competing, and by cornering vertical markets so they could squeeze labor, suppliers, and customers. Now, despite all of this, entertainment monopolies are special because they also aggregate authors' monopolies in vast quantities. These monopolies are durable in ways that mere market power is not. If you control one third of all the music that might be sampled by other musicians, as Universal Music Group does, you have a bottleneck that can't be evaded through cunning or creativity. Any attempt to break your monopoly is a criminal copyright infringement. So anyone who tries to get around your monopoly commits a crime. That is to say, banking and aerospace monopolies might get sued for being anti competitive, but entertainment monopolies can sue you for being pro competitive. The result is a monopoly that controls access to distribution channels and audiences, and that can invoke the power of the state to fine or even imprison people who seek to challenge their monopoly. And even where tech is challenging monopolies, it does so in order to create more monopolies. Think of Kindle Unlimited. It presents a real challenge to traditional genre publishing, but every Kindle Unlimited book is released non negotiably with DRM that locks it forever to Amazon's platform. Any attempt to liberate a Kindle Unlimited book so it can be read on a rival's device or with a device designed to stop Amazon from spying on you while you read involves breaking the DRM, and trafficking in tools to break DRM is a felony under Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Act Copyright Act of 1998. Kindle Unlimited books aren't available in libraries, and if you were to give a librarian a tool to remove the DRM so they could add a Kindle Unlimited book to their collection, you would be committing a jailable offense. As Amazon conquers an ever larger proportion of genre readers, it permanently locks those readers into its platform, meaning any author who wants to access those readers must do so on Amazon's terms, turning over the power of their author's monopoly to be used as part of Amazon's market power monopoly. Give authors more copyright, a stronger monopoly, and Amazon will seize that too, as a condition of reaching the audience that Amazon has imprisoned in its walled garden. Authors' monopolies aren't market power monopolies, but if you can aggregate enough authors' monopolies in one place, you can turn it into a market power monopoly that is backed by the power of the courts and the prisons, and it accumulates more authors' monopolies every time someone enters the captive marketplace. You may have heard Netscape founder Mark Andreessen's famous phrase, software is eating the world. Andreessen was wrong. Software has already eaten the world, past tense. If there was any doubt, the pandemic has erased it. Lockdown, viewing the world through our screens, there is no longer any distinction between human rights and digital rights. There's no longer just software freedom. There's only freedom. Software is expanding relentlessly into every device and system, from ventilators to tractors, from toothbrushes to sex toys, from refrigerator filters to money itself. Wherever we find software, we find IP, software deployed to control the conduct of competitors, critics, and customers in such a way that overlapping systems of law can be invoked to punish anyone who bypasses those controls. The combination of software and IP in every device is a sea change for the organization of our society. As firms have become increasingly concentrated, as monopolies have emerged in every sector, they have also figured out how to infuse their products with just enough software that they can invoke IP to control their competitors, critics, and customers. These are market power monopolies backstopped by creators' monopolies, which create new rights, IP rights that supercharge their market power. And all of this is just a curtain raiser. Software, after all, isn't just a way to put IP into otherwise inert objects. It's also a way to automate those objects, to make them into unblinking, ever vigilant enforcers for the manufacturer monopolist and their interests. They can detect and interdict any attempt at unauthorized interoperability and call the appropriate authorities to punish the offenders. This level of control is beyond the wildest dreams of history's most sociopathic monopolists. Consider the coal boss, who controlled his workers by moving them into company housing in a company town, where they were paid in company script that could only be spent in a company store. This coal boss moves titanic amounts of risk off of his balance sheet and onto his workers. Not only are they incapable of leaving for a better job without paying their debts, but they are also paid in this non interoperable proprietary money that only works at the company store, where prices can be adjusted at will to ensure that those workers' debts are never paid. Even that coal boss, even that man who was a god to his workers, he wasn't all powerful. A coal worker could buy corn at the company store and trade it for real US greenbacks at the local moonshiner shed, converting non interoperable script into interoperable dollars at a loss through the intermediary exchange medium of corn. But think of a worker paid in company script today. The digitally enabled smart goods that they buy at their company store can be locked to their accounts in ways that a Kindle book or an iPhone app is locked to your personal device. The unblinking eye of the software enforcement system is always watching, ready to discipline you for your lack of consideration for the shareholders' bottom line. Once we had cake, today we have icing. And at this rate, the icing will be gone before long because there are no digital rights, only human rights. And there's no longer software freedom, there's only human freedom. And that's the talk.
Thank you so much for being able to come today. Anyone who has questions, we do have about 20 minutes scheduled for that.
So I actually do have a quick question. So as far as like open source and everything goes, I've been getting into a lot of just like CAD files and stuff recently. So like, what are your opinions on open sourcing as far as like design elements that may be like generated, maybe, you know, not necessarily through coding, but just through other stuff like that? And like, should there be like this big network of people collaborating in that way as far as just design elements go?
So I think that we have to unpick like what we mean by should there, right? Like, is it instrumentally beneficial, right? Like, do you get a better design if more people can look at your design? I think that's true, especially when we're talking about functional elements like CAD files. You know, in before there was science, there was alchemy, and alchemy looks a lot like science in as much as like you go and you observe some phenomenon in the world and you design an experiment and you test your hypothesis. And there's a difference between science and alchemy is not that part. It's what you do when you're done. It's whether you allow third parties to scrutinize your work and build on it. And, you know, alchemy never figured out how to turn lead into gold. In fact, most alchemists were so trapped in this paradigm that they all ended up finding out for themselves in the hardest way possible that they really shouldn't be drinking mercury. But alchemists did convert the base metal of superstition to the precious metal of science by exposing their work to third-party review, right? You know, if you hired a firm of engineers to design a building for you, and they said we use proprietary math to figure out the load stresses on the beams, but trust us, it's fine. You really shouldn't ever go into that building. You know, that is undoubtedly not a good building. You know, third-party adversarial scrutiny can like fail to detect defects, but the lack of third-party adversarial scrutiny always fails to detect defects. Your friends will never find your dumb mistakes because they go easy on you. So I think that in that regard, you know, there's this instrumental benefit. There are other elements of this that are, you know, that I think we have to unpick. Like, is it good for society if you can, if there is a commons of these things? Well, there's definitely some uses that will never get made if you have to clear the use first, right? Where the transaction cost exceeds the utility benefit. So just the price of like asking you and getting your permission and getting a contract from you to use your file will exceeds all possible value I get from using your file. And you multiply that by every file and every person using a file, and you get a lot of dead weight loss, right? You get a lot of things that are missing. Now, against that backdrop is the fact that, you know, we don't live in a fully automated luxury communist utopia, and you've got to eat. And, you know, there are ways in which you can extract higher rents for your work if you can maintain a monopoly over them, if you can insist that people only use them with your permission. I think that one of the lessons that we've seen from the last 40 years of lax antitrust enforcement is that the trajectory of that is that over time your right to exclude becomes less and less valuable. That although you have the absolute right to stop people from using your CAD file, just like Amazon has the absolute, or Amazon sellers have the absolute right to stop people from cloning their products, Amazon can still almost clone their products. And because they control access to the market, the fact that you have some exclusive rights doesn't help you at all. You know, an exemplary story about this is what happened with eyeglasses. So about 12 years ago, an Italian eyewear manufacturer called Luxottica took a huge amount of private equity money, and they used that to buy the major eyewear retailers, first Lens Crafters, then Sunglass Hut, Target Optical, most other optical stores in the West anyway. And then what they did was they told all of the eyewear brands, Coach, Dolce & Gabbana, um, uh, Oakley, Oliver Peoples, Versace, every eyewear brand that you've ever heard of, really, except for a couple of oddball internet ones like Warby Parker, that they would no longer carry them in these stores, which represented the vast majority of all retail, unless the company would sell out to them, unless they would just sell the company to Luxottica, which they all ended up doing. Coach was or Oakley was the one holdout, and they did just stop carrying Oakley in all major retailers. And after a year, the company was bankrupt and they bought it for pennies. And you know, the fact that all of these companies had very powerful exclusive rights. I mean, nobody is going to say, oh, Versace fails to understand how to exercise its exclusive rights, was immaterial, because once there was a monopolist, that monopolist could uh, work around those exclusive rights in a way that allowed it to set prices and determine the conditions of the market, irrespective of the desires of eyeglass wearers or eyeglass makers. And it helped that Luxottica was allowed to establish this vertical monopoly, because not only did they own the retailers and the eyewear brands, they also bought Essilor, the French lens giant that had gone on its own buying spree and makes more than 50% of the optical lenses in the world. Now they're a division of Luxottica. And then the combined company that combined every eyewear brand, every eyewear retailer, and the majority of lenses, they went and they bought iMed, which is the world's largest eyewear insurer. And so with the lock on insurance, which is effectively like payments and designs and retail, it really doesn't matter if you have exclusive rights. Your CAD files are irrelevant. And so, you know, there's that old Irish joke that goes like, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. If the argument is that by retaining some exclusive rights to your CAD files, you hold out the possibility of being able to, you know, live a life of sufficiency such that you can make more CAD files and that the whole world benefits, that argument needs to be weighed against the evidence of monopoly.
So I have a quick question.
Sure.
So if you're king for a day, you get to make all the rules, you get to undo this mess that you've laid out pretty clearly is a big mess. What's your way of fixing it?
Well, so it's interesting because, like, as I said in the talk, monopoly arrived in the same way at all of these industries. You know, professional wrestling and eyewear and tech all got monopolized because they all grew by doing things that used to be illegal. So it follows that, you know, if you just restored the pre-Reagan standards for antitrust. So what happened was that from the New Deal until Reagan, the standard for antitrust was to assume that monopolies were guilty until proven innocent, that all monopolies were presumed harmful and had to prove to regulators that they weren't doing things bad. And it was so vigorous that regulators would do things like watch a sector, like say groceries. And if they saw the same companies in the top 2 or 3 positions for more than 5 or 10 years, they would just open investigations into them, because they would go like, there's no way you're holding on to top position for a whole decade just by being the best company. You're doing something with your money, right? You're maintaining your monopoly through your money. And after Reagan took office, there was this guy he quite liked. He tried to make him a Supreme Court judge. His name was Robert Bork. And Bork was a criminal who was implicated in the Richard Nixon Saturday Night Massacre. He was Richard Nixon's Solicitor General who embarked on a wave of illegal firings as Nixon was facing impeachment. And his deeds were so odious that the Senate declined to confirm him for the Supreme Court. And instead, he became a kind of court sorcerer to Ronald Reagan. And he proposed this different theory of antitrust called consumer welfare. And he said, look, you know, these 4 major antitrust laws that the US has starting in the 1890s with the Clayton Act and the Sherman Act, they look like they say monopolies are bad, but you don't know how to read them. If you read them the way I read them, if you read them the way a QAnoner reads a drop, like skip every 3rd word and reverse every 5th word, you will find in them that the actual intent of their authors was not to prevent monopolies, but just to prevent monopolies from doing harm. What is harm? Harm is raising prices. And it's only raising, and moreover, it's only bad, and it's only raising prices, and it's only monopolism if you can prove using an economic model that the reason a price went up is only because of a monopoly and not because of some other factor, some exogenous factor, you know, the oil shock or whatever. It was very much on people's minds in the early 80s. And it turns out that only Bork and his friends at the Chicago School of Economics knew how to make and interpret these models. And so we went from a world where everyone had a say in monopolies because they were considered a political matter. Where are monopolies distorting our public policy? Are they narrowing our choices? Are they reducing our quality of life? To this quantitative exercise that could only be adjudicated by what amounted to a priesthood, who, whenever a merger was proposed or whenever a firm was accused of wrongdoing, they would go and they would slaughter an ox, right? They would make a model and they would spread its guts out. They would interpret the model. And then they would come back and they'd stroke their beards and they'd say, we have done our best to look at this model, and we are here to tell you that all other appearances to the contrary, the thing that you're worried about is not the result of a monopoly. And we know you'd like to check it for yourself, but none of you know how to read and make these models. So it's entirely up to me, right? It's entirely my say so, and you don't get to check my math. And so, like, one thing that we could do that would reverse monopolism across multiple sectors is to just restore the pre-consumer welfare standard, where we say monopolies are bad because they're bad, right? Because when an industry is concentrated and there's only 4 or 5 companies that control it, not only are they able to extract monopoly rents, right? They got more profits. That's why companies make monopolies, right? Is because they're more profitable. But when there's only 3 or 4 entities in the monopoly, they can figure out how to spend the money to get what they want, right? You look at, Facebook and Google, the ad duopoly. So the ad duopoly is not only like explicitly conspiring with one another. There was just some leaks showing that their top executives were having phone calls on the DL where they were like making deals to screw everyone else over on ad rates. But also, like, Sheryl Sandberg, who is the chief operating officer of Facebook, used to be a senior executive at Google. She's like godparent to the children of senior Googlers. They execute her will. She, they meet each other at weddings and bar mitzvahs and funerals. So it's almost impossible for them not to conspire. And so where you have small groups of industrial actors with lots of money to spend, and it's easy for them to figure out what to do, there you go. They get to make a bunch of money, and they get to do it at public expense. They get to do it by screwing everyone else. Now, that said, every industry has its own characteristics. If we had said to the Australian railroad barons, you have to permit interoperability. If someone comes up with a rail car that can drop one set of wheels and extract and retract the other set of wheels and hop from one set of rails to the other, it wouldn't have done us any good. They tried 300 of those designs over 150 years. None of them worked, and they gave up. On the other hand, when Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, he had a really serious problem, an Australian problem. A guy named Rupert Murdoch, who's this Australian robber baron, one of the most rapacious billionaires in the world, the reputation he cherishes for ruthlessness. And good old Rupe owned a service called MySpace, which was the most successful social media network in the world at that time. And he wasn't going to let people leave MySpace and go to Facebook easily. So you could choose Facebook that had a better user interface, but none of your friends, or you could hang out on MySpace that had this terrible, abusive user interface, but all your friends were there. And Zuck didn't go on bent knee to Rupert and say like, Mr. Murdoch, tear down that wall. You just made a bot. If you gave that bot your MySpace login and password, it would visit MySpace pretending to be you. It would scrape all the waiting messages out of your inbox and put them in your Facebook inbox. You reply to them there and it push them back out to MySpace, right? So, if we're looking at tech monopolies, we might say to them, you can't block bots, you can't block interoperability, because with tech, because computers have this underlying characteristic of flexibility, this theoretical characteristic that of Turing completeness. That means that every computer is functionally equivalent. Every computer can run all programs that can be expressed in symbolic logic. These are like, deep theory elements of computer science. My other life is I'm a doctorate in computer science, and I'm on the faculty of computer science at the Open University in the UK. Because of this underlying flexibility, we have a suite of remedies available to us with technology that aren't available to beer, say. And so in technology, I might say, oh, we're going to have some interoperability mandates like those contemplated in the Access Act that was introduced in the last Congress, where you're going to have to expose your APIs, you're going to have to allow scrapers, you're going to have to, and make them programmatically able to access user interface elements. You're going to have to create data portability. And then on top of that, we're going to say that you're not allowed to invoke the law to stop people who make bots, who make scrapers, who reverse engineer, who make interoperable file formats. But what we will do is create a federal privacy law. So if those guys do something sketchy, there will be a cause of action to go after them. But we won't be relying on you like making a determination, hey, is this bad enough for my shareholders that I'll defend my users? Instead, we'll have a user-centric law, a privacy law that will be invoked when there are privacy violations, not a copyright law that you can sometimes choose to cite when you're trying to shut down some privacy violator.
I can hop in with the next one. We have a question from our own Professor Chris Burke, who says, historically, the solution to oppression is violent revolution. The tree of freedom must be watered with the blood of patriots. That can seem like a hard sell to many people when speaking about these abstract ideas. So what is the alternative to blood for you?
Well, Thomas Piketty wrote this like seminal book, Capital in the 21st Century, and I think 2013. And he got like 15 grad students and had them work for 10 years, rounding up every ledger they could find, from like Swedish grain records to like handwritten port logs for 300 years worth of financial data. And he concluded that market societies tend towards inequality unless there is some kind of regulation that reshuffles the money. And that furthermore, that the equality is destabilizing. So throughout the book, he keeps saying like, the degree of inequality that we are approaching here in the second decade of the 21st century is set to exceed the inequality of France in 1778. And I think for a lot of American readers, because he's French, and I think a lot of American readers were like, that's a weird benchmark. France in 1778. What's salient about that? Well, that's the year they built guillotines, right? That's the year that the intrinsic contradictions of inequality and the inability of a grossly unequal society to enact policies that are broadly beneficial, because when wealth is highly concentrated, you can only do stuff if it's either good for rich people or at least not bad for rich people. That at a certain point, everything that's good for people is bad for rich people, and then people get angry and they build a guillotine. And so his plea to the super rich was like, hey guys, you could submit to like a global 2% wealth tax voluntarily, or you could spend a lot of money on guard labor, right? You can build up your fences and pay your Pinkertons and whatever, because like, it's not like a matter of either you redistribute or you don't, and people get angry or they don't. It's like, before you get to the point where people are angry enough for bloodshed to take place, people will have been angry enough that you've been scared about it, and you've been like building luxury bunkers and paying for armed guards and doing all kinds of increasingly expensive and difficult things. And you've got mass demonstrations, and you've got arson attacks and sabotage, and you have regions that devolve into chaos. I mean, Tunisia is kind of a good example of this prior to the color revolutions there, prior to the Arab Spring, where, you know, it's a wildly unequal society. It's widely understood to be horrifically corrupt. That corruption is widely understood to be driven by the wealth inequality, where basically the police just mostly don't make sure that the law gets obeyed. They make sure that no one gores a rich person's ox. And the country erupts into chaos, right? The government falls, the civilization falls apart, the region is now, you know, torn asunder, and so on. So his pitch was like, not only are you headed for guillotines, but long before you get there, your life is going to be miserable. And you know what? Like nearly a decade later, we pretty seriously failed to heed good old Piketty. And so it's not clear to me what will happen. You know, I am finishing a utopian science fiction novel called The Lost Cause. It's a book about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias after a Green New Deal. And it turns on there being a rupture with violence. And that rupture with violence is brought about as a result of a string of um, climate emergencies that, because of the way our industrial relations are structured, no one wants to take adequate measures to defend against, right? In the same way that, you know, we here in California, we were really hard hit by the pandemic. And one of the reasons was that we lacked ventilators, N95s, and masks. Well, there's a funny thing about that story, because it didn't happen in a vacuum. In 2005, Governor Schwarzenegger built a $200 million stockpile of beds, ventilators, and masks, as well as prefab hospitals that could be established, and everything needed to turn every community center and school gymnasium into a hospital. And then the 2008 crisis hit. And for political reasons, the federal government decided not to bail out the states. And so California had a really bad debt crisis. And keeping the batteries charged and paying for the warehouse space for these ventilators and masks and beds was costing $5 million a year. And so they liquidated it. They liquidated the stockpile. And so there is this way in which a failure to make broadly beneficial policies doesn't just hurt people, but it destabilizes civilizations. You know, there's a pretty credible Newsom recall movement underway right now. California likes to recall governors. It's like the only one to have done so in my living memory. And you know, it may be that California has a complete political upset and really deep changes in its structure, many of which will not be beneficial to the people, the deficit hawks who insisted that California shouldn't issue bonds or whatever to pay for that $5 million a year safety measure. Um, and it is the result of that short-sightedness. And so in my book, there are these ruptures. There are these moments where we have future zoonotic plagues caused by loss of habitat. We have refugee crises. We have increasingly intense floods. Wildfire season gets longer. You know, it's pretty widely understood among climatologists that 2020 is not the worst wildfire season we've ever had. It's the best wildfire season we ever will have. That all wildfire seasons after this will only be worse. And so all of that drives this political rupture that creates a new order, a new equilibrium. And, you know, you talk about the Tree of Liberty being refreshed with the blood of patriots. I think a better example comes from Piketty, who talks about how the 30 glorious years, the 1945 to 1975, the years of the welfare state, the years of American prosperity, albeit an unequal and highly racialized prosperity, that the thing that opened the political space for those years, where so much was possible, where we could have a VA bill and we could have help to buy housing and we could have you know, expansion of public roads and electrification and the interstate highway system and all kinds of stuff. The thing that made that possible was the capital destruction of the two world wars in the interwar period. That if you look at the actual capital flows and distribution after the two world wars, it was the most equal that it had been since manumission, since the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, because it reclassified human beings who had been grotesquely marked down on ledgers as assets back as human beings again, was the largest form of wealth destruction in American history up until that point, because the richest people in America's wealth was entirely represented in human flesh. some ridiculous proportion, like 40% of American millionaires all lived in the same slaveholding county. They were neighbors with each other at the time of manumission. And so by lifting the thumb of people who are habituated to insisting on parochial beneficial regulation that serves their interest at the public expense off of the scales, we can start pursuing policy that actually like takes account of facts and evidence as opposed to the wishful thinking of the super wealthy.
I'm going to jump in with one more question from one of our students. And I don't know how long you are able to stay for, but I'm willing to
I
let you
should go
talk as long
after
as
this
it is.
question.
Okay. Considering systemic inequality right now, taxing inheritance on a scale, taxes, living wage, along with possibly a UBI, all seem like good steps toward individual wealth inequality. Cory, what are your views on the intersection between personal wealth and monopolies' impacts on personal freedom?
Sorry, on UBI and personal freedom?
UBI and then things like a wealth
Right.
tax and inheritance
sure.
tax.
So we're getting deep into the weeds on economics here, but I am a proponent of something called modern monetary theory. And modern monetary theory proposes a pretty empirically verifiable account of where money comes from and how spending works that is very different from the widely understood spending conversation that says that governments can only spend if they tax, right? That governments tax us and then they spend our money on programs. And that's not true. It's empirically not true because we don't have any money to be taxed until the government has spent it, right? All the money originates with governments. That's like, you can figure out whether that's true just by making some money. I'll visit you in the pen and we can talk about how your experiment went. So if all money originates with governments, then governments don't spend taxes. And in fact, this is like empirically true. If you ever look at how the Treasury works, for example, and the Fed, the money in the government's account in the Fed doesn't come from taxes. The money that comes in from taxes is obliterated at the point of taxation. The money that is spent by the federal government is created at the moment of spending. There is a risk if you spend too much money that you will try to procure, if you try to procure things that the private sector wants, or if you try to procure more of something than is available, that the price will go up for it. That's inflation, and that's why people worry about taxation and federal debts. But there are lots of things that the feds don't want, right? Or that the public or the private sector doesn't want. Every unemployed person's labor is a thing that the private sector is bidding $0 for, right? The true minimum wage, irrespective of whether Sanders gets his $15 minimum wage, the true minimum wage is zero. That's how much you get paid if no one wants to buy your labor. And so you could, in theory, print as much money as you need, create as much money as you need to pay socially inclusive wages for jobs for people who want jobs. And to the extent that that socially inclusive wage was higher than the private sector was willing to bid, you would in fact create wage inflation, which is another way of saying you'd create a meaningful minimum wage, right? You'd finally set not just a minimum wage, but possibly minimum conditions. So if we had a federal jobs guarantee that was locally administered, so community groups or your town council would figure out what needed doing, care work, environmental remediation work, whatever, and just had shovel ready jobs. And if you ever wanted a job, you could walk into your job center, and instead of being today, if you walk into a job center, it's a place that helps you apply for unemployment insurance. Then it would just be a place where you got a job. They would show you all the jobs that are available. They'd show you all the training programs if none of those jobs were a thing you knew how to do. There would also be whatever kind of unemployment benefits we want to give people. We should. That's a humane thing to do. But if you wanted a job, there'd be a job for you. And it would come with daycare and medical benefits and whatever. And sure, that would mean that there's a lot of people who are misclassified as contractors driving for Uber at a real terms wage of $3 or $4 an hour once you factor in depreciation of their vehicles, who would stop driving for Uber, right? And so in that sense, Uber would have to charge more and pay more in order to have a service, but it would be a much more humane service. And all of that has two pretty important implications. The first is that the reason that we tax is not to pay for government programs, but to take money out of circulation. If you leave money in circulation and you spend new money into the economy and don't take any money out of the economy, eventually you will have like effectively infinite money, right? And then you will get inflation. The people savers will be punished because their money will be worth less, and it'll be harder for them to figure out their retirement or save for a house or another major purchase. And you get what deflationary problems and all kinds of ugly things that arise from not taking money out of the system. And so we take money out of the system, and the money that we don't take out of the system, right? If the government spends $100 million this year and then taxes back $90 million this year, we call the remaining $10 million the deficit. But that's not really the deficit, it's the public surplus, right? What we're actually saying is we left the public with $10 million to keep in its bank accounts. Because if we taxed exactly what we spent, then there wouldn't be any money left over for the public to spend. And so sometimes when the economy is running too hot, we do in fact run government surpluses, which is to say the public runs a debt, right? We net remove money from the economy by taxing more than we're spending. But by and large, we tend to have expansionist spending. One reason that we tax people is not just to remove money from the economy, but to change the power distribution in the economy. Because high concentrations of money produce political outcomes where rich people get to buy policies that make sense for them, even if they don't make sense for everyone else. And so we create these progressive taxes, these sliding scales that attack the concentrations of wealth so that accountable democratic leaders are the ones who make our decisions and not plutocrats in boardrooms, so that our public policy can be set through broad pluralistic means instead of by self-described titans of industry who think that they're infallible and should be left to make policy on their own. And so a UBI is something that is an interesting idea in the absence of this understanding, but a UBI in the long run, I think, worsens inequality if it's not accompanied by taxation. If you can imagine two families, one of whom is living hand to mouth, and the other one may be getting deeper in debt every year, and the other one has all of its expenses covered, and they put a little money every month for retirement, and you give them both $1,000 a month, then at the end of 10 years, the family that's been living hand to mouth, well, they're doing better, right? They've now like met all their basic needs. They're no longer in debt. They're paying their way out of debt. They're no longer precarious. They have more freedom. But the family that was already well off, they're $250,000 richer at the end of a decade of giving them $1,000. So inequality has just gotten worse. And so unless you've got a plan to have steeper, more meaningful progressive taxation, then this UBI is not going to produce a more equal society where our political power is distributed more broadly and not concentrated into a few hands. The other thing that's important to note here is the scale of the climate emergency, because one of the elements of UBI is the belief that we have an automation employment crisis. We don't have an automation employment crisis. There will not be self-driving cars anytime soon. To the extent that automation is making it possible for people to the extent that automation is making it possible for fewer people to do more work, we have lots of work for the people whose hands have just been freed up through automation, because like over the next 300 years, we're going to have to relocate every coastal city in the world 20 kilometers inland. We're going to have to deal with hundreds of millions of refugees. We're going to have not just this one zoonotic pandemic, we're going to have waves of zoonotic pandemics through habitat loss. The Texas freeze over is going to be just a drop in the bucket compared to the extreme weather events, as well as the fires and floods that we're going to face, right? All of that stuff is like on our foreseeable horizon. It is work sufficient for every person alive today and every one of our descendants for an uncountable number of centuries. And so, the idea that it's time to like set down our picks and shovels and pick up a lyre and a laurel and write poetry under a palm tree is a denial of the undeniable reality of our climate emergency.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you were able to make it today. I think we will go ahead and let you go. I'm Wow, this has been maybe the best class we've had all semester. So thank you
Aw,
again.
thank you. So my pleasure. Nice seeing you folks.
Yeah. All right. Well,